Sure. So welcome everyone, and I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which I'm talking to you from today in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia, and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging, and to all Indigenous people joining us today, and of course our brothers and sisters in Aotearoa. So today we're going to talk about two projects. The first is the Return, Reconcile, Renew website and backend and the mapping process, and I'll do a quick introduction to that, followed by Winsome, who will talk about the technical side of things, and then over to Professor Paul Tapsell to talk about the Maori Maps project. So just to give you a little bit of context and background, the Return, Reconcile, Renew project is an Australian Research Council funded project that commenced in 2014, with its overall aim was to raise awareness and understanding about repatriation and to assist repatriation practitioners and researchers in their efforts to bring back old people home. So that is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ancestral remains held in museums and collections all over the world. And so part of this project also is a large component, is a website, which is, you can see on the screen, Return, Reconcile, Renew .info. And this website and digital archive is a major output of the Return, Reconcile, Renew project. And it's been developed since 2014, and it contains a public facing site of the project, which is basically a lot of information about repatriation, what it is, where ancestors were taken, and the efforts for communities in Australia to return those ancestors from all over the world. And there's a lot of information and background there for a really practical guide for communities to look at and to assist them in their repatriation processes. And so as part of this, we've developed a back end of the Return, Reconcile, Renew, which Win will talk about a little bit more, but you can learn a lot more about the website. We've also spent a lot of time working on how to manage highly sensitive information and data, looking at the ethics around collecting this sort of data, and of course, providing community access to the information within the project. So the project worked with three mainly community organisations. So the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Culture Centre, based in Fitzroy Crossing, that's responsible for the return of ancestral remains and secret sacred objects to communities in the Kimberley region of Australia. And we work very closely with the repatriation officer for CALAC, Mr. Neil Carter. The second organisation and group was the Wurundjeri Regional Authority, and they are based in South Australia, all along the Coorong. And the third organisation was GBK in the Torres Straits, and Ned David has been working tirelessly in the Torres Straits around repatriation issues. So the RRR team has an international team, and it benefits from the expertise of not only the First Nations organisations in the project, but also a large collaborative team of universities right across Australia and internationally, with representation, of course, from New Zealand with Professor Paul Tapsell. We have Ona Kilo in the United States, and we have a whole range of partners from Japan and European institutions. So we work closely with the Australian government and the Department of Arts and their repatriation team, as well as with the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. And so the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies will be the repository of a lot of data and information that has come in through this project and through the research undertaken by an extensive global team of researchers. And so as part of this project, we've done many things around protocols in dealing with sensitive information and data, and also the interrelationship between digitizing that information in an archive, but also being able to keep that information away from the public view where it's very sensitive and at the request of our Indigenous First Nations partners. So in the field of repatriation, there are a number of things that we have been working on, not only developing the back end and the website, but we've also been working in developing a training course for practitioners in repatriation. So this training course is run through ANU, and it's a master's accredited course, but we also encourage people to undertake the course in repatriation, from museum practitioners to community members that work in the repatriation and cultural heritage space. And so this is a global course that's taught in the first instance, first few years before COVID, it was taught on country, in Nurrinjeri country, and of course in the Kimberley, we ran a course up there. And we're hoping to get back on country to run courses, but over the last 2 years during COVID, we've been running the course online. So I'm going to just hand over to Win now. Maybe the next slide, Win, actually.
Yep. Thank you very much, Lyndon. So recently, RRR's been getting into mapping for a few reasons, particularly in the restricted access section of the archive and the private access section. The large and increasing volume of information and records is making it harder to find stuff. So maps are one technique we're using to enhance usability and findability of records. Also, though, look at the map here. A map like this gives you something that a huge long list of records doesn't. Looking at this, you can immediately get a sense, an immediate sense of the global nature of removal and repatriation, and also a sense of the global relevance of the archive. We're also finding for our community partners that maps are also useful in terms of reburial planning work. So for the communities to immediately be able to see the provenances of their ancestors and where they are now is useful, and also mapping useful as well for documenting reburial sites. So we're quite new to this work. What we've been realizing is we've just been thinking about how to map and what to map. We've realized what our needs are. The key ones are listed here. The first one to do with security is probably been the most significant for us. And this is particularly to do with the sensitivity of the data that we're wanting to map. So we don't want to upload this content to somebody else's server. We want to have control of it. We don't want anything happening like Google secretly indexing everything, for example. Also, as we were plotting and scheming and thinking, we've been trying to figure out what to map. You can map pretty much anything you like if you try hard enough. But what we don't just want maps that look cool, although that's nice, but we want them to be useful. So we've settled for now on QGIS, an open source mapping tool. It's pretty stable. You can download all of the code and edit it pretty easily as you like. Lots of users, lots of extensions, and you can generate a map like you can see here into HTML, and then we can link the map very neatly and smoothly to pages in our archive. So the map that I'm showing you here is a snapshot of the map for the collecting institutions that we've got documented in the archive. You click on one of them, up comes a pop-up, and then you can follow the link through to the full entry for that organisation in the archive. So doing this work, and we're still in the early phases, but some of the immediate ideas that it's raised for us is firstly the value of open source, partly because the open source universe is just a beautiful anti-capitalist model for developing software, but also in terms of project funding, which relates to archive sustainability, it's also very useful for that reason as well. Our project isn't locked in until the end of time, having to pay for license fees, for example. The other thing that this work has raised is the dangers of a lot of, well, for us anyway, of a lot of free or almost free online mapping tools, which are, there's millions of them and they're brilliant. And if our data wasn't sensitive, that would probably meet all of our needs. But a lot of the tools that we tested, even though it looked like it was a secure thing, there were passwords, there were blah, 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 but you go through the fine print of their privacy policies, or, you know, all of their policies and all the rest, and you see that actually they're not quite perfect. The other big challenge that we still haven't perfectly found a solution to is, where do you put the pin on a map? This is particularly in terms of mapping provenances. Sometimes there'll be a provenance for an ancestor, and it'll be very clear and easy to know today exactly where they came from. But more often than not, it's not like that. And there'll be provenances that might say something like, you know, from a museum catalogue or wherever, collector diary. You know, these remains were found a 20-minute walk south of this town, which makes you think, how fast does the person walk? So there's also, in terms of mapping provenances, a provenance might be, for example, for New South Wales, but the state of New South Wales now, the border, is different to the colony of New South Wales previously. And so there are all those sorts of issues as well. So just wanting to put information onto a map because it is very useful, but not wanting to get it wrong, wanting to make it clear that the maps that we're making, they're not gospel. The other idea raised is, so the living archive thing. We've always described RRR as a living archive, and in a way we've said that, meaning that we're going to be keeping on working on it, data will be added, and so on. But starting to think that we should have a similar sort of approach in terms of the software that we use. So QGIS is working brilliantly for us right now. It's meeting out all of our immediate needs. It's very possible, though, that we'll find something else in the future. And so that sort of relates to making sure whatever tools you're using, data can go in and come out very easily. And so again, that you're just not locked into the one thing. Future things, there's a lot. So more detailed provenance mapping. So for example, so a user, say coming from New Zealand, could click a pin on New Zealand, zoom in to their particular community within New Zealand, and then up comes all of the records relating to remains from that location. Mapping records, I'm not sure if this is going to be useful or if it's just going to be cool, we'll see, but we have things like museum catalogues, for example, that refer to remains from lots of different communities, maybe around Australia and also around the world. So to be able to put all of those provenances from one record, one catalogue onto a map, I think will be pretty interesting. And then just the last thing to say, that this mapping work that we're still figuring out is just one part of everything else that we're doing in the archive to make the archive work. So this mapping stuff combined with developing our search facility, a lot of that to do with metadata, doing thorough indexing of all of the records that we've got, and as well combining some of this with network visualization stuff as well. So all of this and mapping with the aim of making an archive that's relevant, people can find stuff that's relevant to them, and it works. So that's where we are. And I might hand over to Paul to talk about Maori Maps.
Kia ora, Win. Tuatahi te kōrero te matumaku ki tō tātou ranga. I ngai tua marae maha o tuku rohe o Ngaitahu, me te ngā tupuna o Wurundjeri Kulin Nation, haere hana reira, tēnā koutou. So just first acknowledgements to the ancestors on the land I'm speaking from, and I see Gerard, my my contemporary is online as well, and belonging to the Ngaitahu people here where we live, and to also acknowledge those elders past, present, and get to take on the responsibility in the future of the wider Melbourne, Victoria regions. My acknowledgement, warm acknowledgement to them. And I miss all you fellas back in Melbourne, been locked down here. So hopefully soon, one more week, we might get there yet. Actually, we can get there, we can't get back out. That's a big problem at the moment. Anyway, Maori Maps is we're 12 years now in the journey from an idea that was actually 13 years that came out of a museum space back in the mid-2000s, when a lot of our Maori team that worked at the Auckland Museum, we were having trouble pinpointing actually where a lot of the taonga came from, and a project in particular called Kotawa, which made necessary that we went back to the communities of origin, the source communities, to meet the elders and discuss the taonga we had held in the museum, the ancestral treasures, a bit like what Wynne was talking about. And we discovered that without the elders showing us where to go, we couldn't find anything anywhere. And we thought, we're pretty well connected. What's it like for the second, third, fourth generation Maori growing up in cities that have very little access to the Maori world anymore? Yet that's the anchor of our identity. So the driving reason for us developing Maori Maps, which started off as literally an analog map book, and 12 years later, it's become a digital gateway, which required us to visit each of those marae or community centres where our elders for generations have lived and died and been buried. And these questions that were raised by and talked about by Wynne and Lyndon were questions that we had to broach as well, the ones of public and private. How do we engage in communities and maintain the boundaries of that belong to the community, what we call the tapu, the respected knowledge, the restrictions that go with those communities, versus making the community accessible to their descendants who have been disconnected through the colonisation process. So we started off with a pilot program, and then that expanded to the rest of the country. And we visited in person just under 780 marae over a span of 5 years. So it was a fairly big undertaking. Fortunately, we were well funded through research grants, NGOs, and charitable organisations that believed in the reconnection of Māori will be good for all of New Zealand and help them be in partnership with the development of our future.
So, Paul, you're about to run over time for questions.
Okay, almost finished. So the journey that I'm speaking about, and it's really critical to understand, is that when we're creating a digital gateway for our young and not so young Māori to re-engage with their communities, be it around their ancestral remains or just reconnection, we've got to choose where that gateway is and what's private and what's public. So the essence of, if you go to the next slide, the essence of our whole function is to provide knowledge that is already in the public domain, and the knowledge that is in the private domain remains the marae communities, such as the one you can see on the left. They will have access to their own private information, and they police or decide they gatekeep that. It's not our job. We're the interface, and we link around about 20,000 users every month to their ancestral communities and their engagement. So we've used the learnings from Maori Maps and our team that we have here in New Zealand at Aotearoa to assist Wynne and our team over in Australia. And like as has been learnt the hard way, always got to be nimble. It's an interface that requires constant adding of layers and testing, and things go out of date rapidly. So you can never sit back. It's always grow, 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 or else you die, as is the case for the digital world. I'll finish there. Kia ora.
Thank you very much, Paul and team. There's one question from Nick in the Q&A. Did you consider a time-layered cultural map project?
I can answer that. Yeah, we're familiar with that project, but at the moment we've just really spent quite a bit of time going through cultural protocols with the community partners and working on getting our own data set up and running at this particular point in time. But thanks, a very good question, Nick. We might be able to chat a bit more about that as we progress with our data. So we did move from the e-research centre at Melbourne Uni to ANU. And so we've moved on to a different platform. And so as it settles back down, and when you might be able to talk about the archive that it's now sitting on, after the closure of the e-research centre, so we're sort of forced to make a move quite rapidly.
Yeah, so now the archive is based at ANU, and the Australian Data Archive hosted through the National Computing Infrastructure. And one of in terms of software and systems, the sudden closure of the eScholarship Research Centre, where we previously had a huge amount of IT support, made us very, very aware of the fact that we need more mastery over the software that we're using, which is why we're very keen now on pieces of software that have a really active, strong community of users and code that can be understood and manipulated by people like me who aren't, IT rocket scientists. Yeah.
Thank you. Any more questions, Q&A, or raise your hand, please? Got a little bit more time. Maybe I'll just add one more. I didn't get a sense how many records you were able to collect for your RRR database.
In the restricted access section of the archive, there's probably about 5,000 published resources and archival resources. But as well, in the restricted access part of the archive, we've got several hundred entries on collectors of remains and collecting institutions and repatriation policies and things like this. So it's well into the thousands. But it's sort of more than that, because any person, anyone involved in removal of remains, there's sort of 20 stories in one. So a collector is tied to institutions and tied to place and to events and legislation. So it's the archive that we have, it's a relational network sort of thing.
Thank you. Great to see those kind of ARC funded collaborations between Australia and New Zealand. It's a fantastic project. Thank you very much.